population. The North basically consisted of two-thirds of the population were Protestants and a third were Catholic, and Catholics were suffered a whole series of forms of disqualification and prejudice. In response to this, and we're leading into the campaigns, this is the beginning of the campaign for the Irish Republic in the North through the Sinn Féin and the Irish Republican Army, which I'll talk about next week, begins really with the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association that is set up in 1967-1968. It has 5 main demands: one man, one vote, to be applied to local government. They had the vote in terms of parliamentary elections, but not in terms of local government, because many of them weren't ratepayers because they didn't own their own houses. An end to the gerrymandering of constituency boundaries, so that the Catholics weren't all placed distributed amongst Protestant majorities. An end to the discrimination of public housing, because public housing was distributed to Protestants first, and an end to discrimination in jobs. And then the final demand, which was the disbandment of the B specials, the sort of special constabulary of the police force, which many people viewed as a sectarian organisation. There was a very big civil rights protest march in Derry in 1968 that was viciously suppressed by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the Protestant-led police force, and that was televised around the world and radicalised many people, not just in Northern Ireland, but many others began to support the emerging Republican cause in Northern Ireland, which I'll come to next week. So rather breathlessly, appropriately, I won't dwell for questions, but we'll move straight into the sexual revolution.
Annus Mirabilis. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. Up till then there'd only been a sort of bargaining, a wrangle for a ring, a shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. Then all at once the quarrel sank. Everyone felt the same, and every life became a brilliant breaking of the bank, a quite unlosable game. So life was never better than in 1963, though just too late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP.
So that was a poem by Philip Larkin, and it's just as well that sexual intercourse did begin in 1963, because otherwise I wouldn't be standing here before you. If it had been much later, it would have been a real problem. But you get the point. I mean, Larkin is basically writing about the emergence of this new permissive moral environment that I've been talking to you about this morning. A key part of that process was, in many ways, the increasing attention given to same-sex relations. Remember, there'd never been really any public discussion of same-sex relationships between women. Okay, on the principle, on the Lady Chatterley's principle, that it's not something that you want your wife or your servants to hear because they might just think it's a better idea than having sex with men. Okay, so never any public discussion about same-sex relations between women, but certainly a good deal of interest in same-sex relations between men, because the criminalization of homosexual sex between men had become a real problem, particularly for the police force in London. So in 1954, an official report is begun called the Wolfenden Report that basically begins from the recognition that the police could not police the public soliciting of same-sex relations between men. What it does is it very minutely maps the homosexual world of London, with providing everybody with a guide to which are the public conveniences, or which are the parks, or which are the bars where you're most likely to be able to hook up with someone. And so an immense amount of official attention and interest in this issue. And Wolfenden therefore suggests that policing is impossible and proposes the decriminalization of homosexual sex. Not because that in itself was a good thing, but because it would take sex off the streets. It would take it out of the public domain and put it into the private domain, where men could go about their business without others having to potentially be confronted with it. Now, the important thing to notice here, it takes a decade for this actually to happen, for people to get their head around the decriminalisation of homosexual sex. It comes in 1967 in Scotland, where particularly homophobic society at that point. It's not introduced until 1980, so this doesn't come in equally all over the country. That's important to recognise. It's also important to recognise that the decriminalisation only happens for men over 21. Okay, so that the age of consent was fixed at 21 for men, as opposed to 16 for people engaged in heterosexual relations. It wasn't until 1994 that the age of consent between men was reduced to 18, and eventually on equal terms at 16 in 2000, in the year 2000. So this is a long-running process, but it's important, and it's important to recognise that reform doesn't come out of an agenda of emancipation, but out of an agenda of how best to police and regulate homosexual sex. I'm not going to talk to you about the pill because I haven't got time. I want to make a similar point about the emergence of the culture of sex in the 1960s, which is to suggest that freer sexual relations, heterosexual relations, in many ways didn't stem simply from an emancipatory project of trying to liberate things for men and women, but came out of commercialization and the licensing of male heterosexual pleasure through the commercial provision of sex. Okay? A great example of this was the development of Soho, that area in London next to the West End, which was the area that became the licensed space of commercial sexual clubs, of strip parlours and film clubs and all the rest of it. Into that space arrives the Playboy Club in 1966, the first sort of official sex club, if you like, that arrives in London. Another great example of this is this publication of The Joy of Sex in 1972, a book that I was absolutely very familiar with as a young man, although it slightly traumatized me because you can see all the illustrations in it, the men had beards, and I was thinking, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to have sex until I grow a beard. I knew exactly what to do when I had a beard, because the book laid it out in glorious technicolor, but it was the beard that was a real definite problem. And I actually only grew a beard, quite recently. So, anyway, I digress. The Joy of Sex is interesting because it's written by this guy, Alex Comfort, who was a pacifist. He was a member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. He was an anarchist. He was also a doctor. Okay, so Comfort is certainly on that, if you like, 60s side of freer sexual relations as being a thing about personal and social emancipation. He was very much tied up with that world. The book sells something like 12 million copies, but critically, if you read that book, it's all about male pleasure. It's all about, it's not the culmination of the Mary Stopes tradition, of the perfect achievement of mutual orgasm. It's basically all about the servicing of male pleasure. A similar story you could tell with the fashion industry, which again is transforming in the 1960s. So the story of the 1950s, the archetypal woman in the 1950s, is Elizabeth Taylor. God bless her soul. May she rest in peace, or whatever the appropriate expression is. So a fully rounded, voluptuous figure like Liz Taylor had, was the look in the 1940s and the 1950s, and it came in many ways out of the new look, the new fashion look of the that came with the end of rationing, the rationing of clothes, and suddenly the opening up of a more lush use of material that was available. So in the 50s, women's dress designs were very full in order to celebrate that you have all of this material and you can experiment with design in a way that you couldn't under utility clothing. In the 1960s, you get the emergence of the stick figure, androgynous figure that lives with us today in the figure of Twiggy, the Daily Express's face of 1966. So again, one of the things that you have, although I never really get this, but that is that you have the transformation of the ideal women's body that happens through the fashion industry, and through, particularly important, the arrival of fashion pages in the mainstream newspapers. Papers like the Daily Express began to run fashion columns with some of the big famous fashion photographers who in themselves were becoming celebrities in the 1960s. People like David Bailey and I'm blanking on the other names. I'm rushing through all of this pretty quickly. Okay. What this does is lead to, well, it doesn't lead to, there's lots of things that lead to this, but at the end of the decade, what we have is the arrival of the third wave of feminism. And in Britain, that doesn't happen until 1970. Okay? Much, much later than in France, where, of course, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex came out in 1949. Much, much later than the US, where Betty Friedan's Feminist Mystique came out in 1963. The British feminist movement really doesn't get started until 1970. And again, it's a post-colonial intellectual, Germaine Greer, from Australia, who publishes The Female Eunuch, as well as Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, which was very influential in that same year. Two other things happen in 1970 that bring third wave feminism to the attention of the population at large. One was the first ever Women's Liberation Conference that came out of the History Workshop movement, organised at Ruskin College, Oxford, a very unlikely place in many ways for the first Women's Liberation Conference, but it was all those historians who were fed up with the lefty men just talking about class all the time and said, come on, we've got to talk about the position of women in history. And it was these figures who began at the Women's Liberation Conference. That organized, well, I'll say more about them in a minute. Many of those figures began to organize the famous Miss World protest, Miss World competition protest that very same year in the Albert Hall. And I have to play you this clip, even though I don't have time to do it, but you're going to love it.
I am very, very happy to be here
Bob
at this
Hope
cattle
presenting
market
the
tonight.
Miss World competition.
Moo.
Listen to the heckling.
Now it's quite a cattle market. I've been back there checking calves. Now, the fight to save our wildlife has many rewards, ladies and gentlemen, not the least of which is getting your wife to wear a cloth coat.